So we're just about ready to begin again. I hope everyone got a chance to have some lunch or some breakfast, whatever is applicable to your respective time zones, as we are not all in Eastern, of course. So I know some people left the room just to have a break, so we'll invite them back in as they come in, and we're quickly thereafterwards going to move on to Erin's module for the workshop today. And I'm going to remind people, Caesar mentioned it at the beginning, but this is one workshop in a series of three, once again, with support from Shantz Mennonite Church. And we're going to hold the subsequent two workshops following the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW, which is scheduled for later this month. So this is seen as somewhat of an initial introduction to the topic, and there will of course be things to reconvene about and discuss after that initial meeting.
Can you remind us when the meeting is again? I know I should know this.
You're quizzing me, Jess? I think it's the 21st.
I know Caesar's going to be there.
Caesar will be there, so we'll hear from him. Is it the 21st, Caesar?
It is, and Erin may well reiterate some of this, but it's two separate meetings, both happening in Vienna. A one-day meeting on the 20th, which is a conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, and there's a precedent for this, and Erin may well comment on this. And then from the 21st to the 23rd, a three-day meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This being the first meeting of states parties since its adoption in July of 2017.
Okay, so that's in June. And then when's the NPT meeting finally taking place?
The NPT review conference, this is the 5-yearly review conference that normally is to 2010, 2015, 2020. Because of the pandemic has been, I think, twice delayed, and now dates have been set for August. Normally the preparatory committees that preceded are week-long preparatory committees sort of in the lead up to this, but this is a month-long conference, so the whole month of August at UN headquarters in New York.
That's intense.
So Erin, whenever you feel up to the task, I know I'm looking forward to your session here. I'm sure I'm not the only one. So whenever you're up to it, feel free to take it away.
Oh, great. Thanks, Kelsey. Thanks, Ploughshares, and thanks for all of you for spending your midday, I guess, for most of you with us. My name is Erin Hunt. I'm the program manager at Minds Action Canada. We're like Ploughshares an ICANN partner, and I'm here to talk about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is something I've spent a lot of the past 10 years working on through pretty much the whole process. And in the negotiations, I was part of a team that worked on the positive obligations, which is something you will know what I mean by that within a little bit. So I'm speaking to you today from Lekwungen territory on the west coast of Canada. And it's really important for me to sort of acknowledge where I'm speaking from, not only to recognize the traditional owners of the land, and also because we are currently situated somewhere that is at the highest risk for nuclear weapons in Canada. Many people don't know this, but the United States has a very large submarine base, as well as a few other bases on Puget Sound, which is part of the Salish Sea. And so that means that the beach that's a couple of blocks from where I'm sitting right now, and my internet connection has gone to crap. So hopefully you can still hear me. I see a thumbs up, we're good. Okay. That is somewhere that nuclear armed submarines transit on depending on the time of year, weekly or monthly basis. So this is far from a remote issue for us. Now, to get started with our conversation about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, I wanted to just introduce a phrase to you, which is called humanitarian disarmament. Now, this is a a term that Canada actually invented back in the 90s when concerned about the huge impact that landmines were having on people. Canada led the world in partnership with like-minded countries, with the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, a civil society organization, and the Red Cross and the UN to negotiate a treaty banning a weapon. Humanitarian disarmament is an approach to disarmament where you look at what weapons do to people and use that to sort of impact your policy, your law. Unlike other more traditional forms of arms control where you're counting who has how many warheads and then trying to balance that out in some way. And this humanitarian disarmament approach, this humanitarian approach is really important to understanding how we got to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I'm gonna follow along with my colleagues, and I've got a fun little, I'm gonna call it fun, quiz for everyone today. And yeah, now you can see that I have multiple tabs open instead of just doing what I'm supposed to be doing here. So if you go to menti.com, I have a different code than Matt or Caesar. It's 4839-1636. And I'd like to know, when do you think was the first time the international community, like all the countries, came together to discuss what nuclear weapons do to people and do to cities? So I'll give you guys a few minutes to get your votes in. Yeah. Let's see, give you another second here. All right. So we have 1958 at some of the height of the nuclear weapons testing. We have 1971, which was, you know, a very tense period for the Cold War with the Vietnam War going on. 1983, when there was a lot of international cooperation or international outrage about nuclear weapons and then arms race. 1992, after so I see we have a majority vote for 1958, but unfortunately, that is incorrect. The correct answer is 2013. Sorry for the person who voted moments before I said the correct answer and got it wrong. But yes, the first large-scale international meeting to discuss the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons took place in 2013. Every time I say this, I'm supposed to tell you how many years that is between the invention of nuclear weapons and their first use in 1945 and when we had this first meeting. And every single time, that mental math is way beyond me, but we're going to go with multiple decades there. And if someone helped my mental math in the chat, I would really appreciate that. Yes, congratulations on your cynicism paying off. Great. So this first humanitarian meeting was really crucial because the TPNW, or the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which I'm going to call the TPNW for the rest of the time I talk because that's a long treaty name. It was really born out of humanitarian considerations and inspired by the humanitarian disarmament tradition that Canada created. So before this first humanitarian impact meeting, back in 2010, the NPT's final document recognized the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, which was something that we hadn't really seen before. And it's also why in 2010 is the first time you have NATO codifying its nuclear alliance status, as Matt mentioned. In 2013 was the first humanitarian impact meeting, and this one was held in Oslo, Norway. And what it did is it brought together the states, the International Committee of the Red Cross, international organizations, academics, and civil society, led by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which had been inspired by the International Campaign to Ban Landmines and was founded in 2007. So a few years after its founding, ICANN is here in the room for the first humanitarian impact meeting. So what they were there to do is to talk about what would happen if a nuclear weapon was ever used again, whether it was intentional use or an accident. And then they realized that this was a big topic. I mean, it's something they should have been talking about starting in the 50s, but they had decades worth of data and information and changes to go through. So that meeting was followed up by 2 meetings in 2014, one in Nayarit, Mexico, and one in Vienna, Austria. And the outcome of these meetings essentially found that there's no possible response to a future nuclear detonation, especially not one in a city. That nuclear detonations, a single nuclear detonation or a limited nuclear conflict would have devastating impacts both on humanity and on the environment. And really crucially, they also looked at the legal frameworks around nuclear weapons, and it found that there was a legal gap that needed to be filled with regards to nuclear weapons. And I'm sorry, or very happy to tell you that we're going to get a little nerdy soon and talk about the legal side of things. So at the end of the meeting in Vienna, Austria put out this pledge for states to endorse, where they vowed to fill that legal gap. And then from there, the diplomatic action moved to the United Nations, where the UN General Assembly convened an open-ended working group, which is really a fancy name for a meeting of governments that discuss nuclear. Based on the recommendations of that working group, the UN General Assembly in 2016 voted to start negotiations on a new legal instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons. Unfortunately for us in Canada and a lot of our NATO allies actually voted against starting negotiations. And then you heard from other speakers that we were under a lot of pressure to not participate in the negotiations process. And unfortunately, we did not. However, Freedom of Information Act requests have indicated that the Canadian mission in New York still sent an intern to sit there and take notes during negotiations, because they knew that if they sent someone actually from the mission, someone like Caesar or myself and the other Canadians involved in the negotiations would recognize them. So they sent their new summer intern to conveniently hide in the back and keep them updated on what was happening. So why did we need a new treaty? I mean, you've heard from other speakers that nuclear weapons are really horrific, but it was because of this legal gap they identified. And to understand this legal gap, we have to talk a little bit about international humanitarian law, which is, the law of war. If you're in the military, it's called LOAC, the Laws of Armed Conflict. But essentially, this is international law that governs both the conduct and the methods of warfare. And 2 of the principles within international humanitarian law that are really important for nuclear weapons are proportionality and distinction. Now, I'll start with distinction because it's a little bit easier to understand. Essentially, international humanitarian law says that you always have to be able to distinguish between combatants, people taking part in the conflict, and civilians, those who are not taking part in the conflict, or persons ordered to combat who may have been taking part in the conflict but are no longer taking active part because they're injured, for example. And you may only target the persons taking part in conflict. Likewise, you can only target military objectives when we're looking at places and things, and you can't target civilian objects. So for nuclear weapons, obviously this is a principle that nuclear weapons fail on. There is no way a nuclear weapon can distinguish between combatants and civilians, or civilian objects and military objectives. The nature of these weapons is such that they're just too big. You can't make those distinctions. And then proportionality is a little bit more complicated because proportionality allows that, you know what, sometimes things go poorly in conflict, and that to meet your military objectives, if you're targeting military personnel, you're targeting military object, that sometimes there might be some damage to civilians or civilian objects. So proportionality says that if you expect that there's going to be casualties among civilians or damage to civilian objects, that has to be in proportion to the military advantage gained. And if it's going to cause too much civilian harm, you cannot go ahead with that plan. So again, the nature of nuclear weapons means that you can't, they're disproportionate all the time. So really, you could make the case that nuclear weapons are prohibited under basic, bare bones international humanitarian law. These principles are globally accepted, and nuclear weapons inherently violate both of them. But, you know, people don't like to do things that don't fit in with their plans. So that's essentially been ignored for a lot of people. And something that we've learned in the humanitarian disarmament community and in disarmament more broadly is sometimes you need explicit law to prohibit a specific weapon. And that's the case with nuclear weapons. So the negotiations that happened in 2017 aimed to come up with specific law and fill that legal gap with a new treaty. So there was negotiations in March, and then there was negotiations in June and July, and the treaty was adopted on July 7th, 2017, and was open for signature in September. So what that means, March, June, July, we were negotiating, talking about the text, changing little bits. On July 7th, they added the word "ah" to the text in one spot to change the whole meaning of a sentence. And Kelsey, I see you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
I do, yeah. Just kind of on the how sweeping the assessment is that all nuclear weapons would not kind of would breach IHL. So, for instance, we heard earlier that there is kind of a suite of different types of nuclear weapons. For instance, one that has kind of entered into the popular zeitgeist recently is this idea of tactical nukes, kind of in discussion of what's happening in Ukraine. Would those, for instance, also likewise breach IHL? Are they just too indiscriminate, or is there some wiggle room there? What does that look like?
I think if we're going to get real nerdy on things, tactical nuclear weapons still have a pretty indiscriminate impact, for example, on the environment and the lasting radiation impacts. So that means, I mean, if you irradiate a patch of land, that still becomes, all land eventually becomes civilian. So I think the long-term impacts of nuclear weapons, even if they're small, really crosses the line for both distinction and proportionality. But yeah, good question. And I mean, really also depends on who's, where you're using a tactical nuke.
Sure.
Which I dislike the phrase in general. I think it's dumb.
I would agree. Thank you so much, Erin.
trying to get around international stigma on it. But yeah, so when a treaty is adopted, that's when we're finished negotiating, fixing the language. And then you have to have a little bit of a break so that people can take this treaty home to their countries, decide whether or not they're going to sign it. And then we had a signing ceremony in 2017. And then in October, ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize, which was wonderful. And then the treaty had enough states sign and then embed the treaty into their national law, that in 2021, in January, the treaty entered into force. So it became binding for all the countries that have embedded it into their own law. Yeah, so the treaty is really quite simple. It has a preamble, and that lays out why the treaty exists and what it aims to accomplish. Then Article 1 is about the prohibited acts, and it lists a bunch, including using, possessing, trading, or developing nuclear weapons. Articles 2 to 5 are about implementing these prohibitions, and that includes things like safeguards and national legislation. Articles 6 and 7 are the ones that I worked on, and they contain the positive obligations. The obligation to provide victim assistance and environmental remediation to communities affected by nuclear weapons use and testing, and to cooperate internationally to pursue the aims of the treaty. So Article 8 in the treaty sets out the need for meetings of states parties, which you've already heard is the first one's coming up very soon. And then Articles 9 through 20 are mostly administrative and, yeah, honestly, a little dull. So I'll put the link to the full treaty text in the chat for you if you want to have a look at that. And then I've also been asked to talk a little bit about the relationship with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. So the NPT was negotiated decades ago. It's often referred to as the cornerstone of the nuclear disarmament architecture. But people who say that, I don't think they actually know anything about architecture, because what do we do with a cornerstone? We build on it. So you can't just put a cornerstone down and say, that's the cornerstone, we're good to go. If you actually want to build anything, you put the cornerstone down, you have your little ceremony with the fancy person putting down the cornerstone, and then you build on it. And then you will hear criticism from some people that the TPNW, weakens the NPT or has issues, and it doesn't do that. You don't weaken a cornerstone by building on it. So the NPT actually came out of the TPNW fully came out of language in the NPT. Yes, I know the acronyms are terrible, and even the people who spend their days working on this do get them mixed up. So the NPT, the older one, the one that has a large, that Caesar talked about, Article 6 says that states have to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. So after decades of not seeing much action on this Article 6, the states that were pushing forward the TPNW decided to take action because it's time to fully implement Article 6. And prohibiting nuclear weapons is currently an effective measure relating to ending the nuclear arms race and nuclear disarmament. We know that banning weapons comes before their elimination. That's what Canada taught the world when we banned landmines. The TPNW is actually just a logical follow-up to the NPT's bargain between nuclear armed states and non-nuclear armed states, that nuclear armed states won't get nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapon states won't get nuclear weapons, nuclear armed states will disarm. And so the NPT is building on, is the cornerstone, and the TPNW is building on that. So really quickly, we're coming up to the first meetings of states parties, which you've heard a bit about already. I'm not going to go over the dates and everything again because Caesar covered that nicely for me. So we're expecting about 100 governments to participate, and we expect that they're going to adopt a political declaration that responds to recent threats of the use of nuclear weapons and current level of risk. We think they're going to develop processes and procedures for providing assistance to victims of use and testing. We think they're going to decide on key aspects, including like deadlines for destruction of nuclear weapons by nuclear armed states joining the treaty, and how they're going to increase the membership of the treaty in face of like our current global situation. And as you heard already, there's going to be a humanitarian impact meeting, and there's a specific meeting for parliamentarians that 1 or 2 Canadian parliamentarians will be attending. And I'm sure you're going to hear more about that from Caesar. Now, before I ask you guys for questions, I have a question for you. I want to know, hopefully I can get this. Come on. I have no idea why I can't get the next screen to show, but I will figure that out for you in 1 second here. As soon as I get the other screen up, I'd like to know what you guys think are the most important parts of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which I think will be helpful because we'll be able to look at that for what sort of tools we can help provide people. It'll help inform how we talk to Canadian decision makers, and it'll help inform what, Mines Action Canada and Ploughshares how we can support you talking to your parliamentarians. Well, Jessica, go ahead, and then we can look to the fun ranking job.
Okay, yeah, I was just about going to vote, but you mentioned the positive obligations. Is this unique to that treaty, or are there other treaties for arms control that have similar obligations on states for victim assistance and environmental remediation?
In the nuclear weapons field, the TPNW is unique in having any provisions for victims or for environmental remediation. But there's a long tradition in humanitarian disarmament of supporting victims, assistance for victims, and in other treaties it's often referred to as clearance of explosive remnants of war or something like that, but also cleaning up after conflict. So it's a very common thing in disarmament in the last 20 years, but very new for nuclear weapons. Excellent. So you should be able to pick now which parts of the TPNW are most important to you. And we'll try and see how we can support Canadians taking action on those going forward. And did I see Caesar have his hand up as well for a question?
Yes, thanks, Erin. Super useful. No, just to comment on this question, on this very question on the slide right now, important parts of the TPNW. I mean, the TPNW itself, the fact that there was this very concrete manifestation of the frustration of the international community and the desire to make progress, I think is in itself a very powerful political statement. And just on the first ranked aspect, the prohibitions, which I agree with, with this feeling in the room, that's critical. I think the prohibition on possession is critical because it puts them in immediate non-compliance, so to speak, because under the NPT there was this sliding interpretation of compliance where they would still say, well, we're making some progress in good faith, but we all knew you still have the weapons, and that's where the risk lies. I think the TPNW goes further and speaks of possession. I mean, just having them is problematic, and I think that sets a new tone in the stigmatization of these weapons.
Yeah, and to be honest, that prohibition is probably the one that nuclear armed states are most concerned about. Nuclear armed states alternate between the TPNW is useless and you guys wasted your time, and the TPNW is going to damage international security. I wish they'd make up their mind. I mean, they're wrong on both, but pick one.
Yeah, if I could, and I know Matthew, but in hot pursuit of that point of possession and raising the bar, soon after the adoption of the TPNW, Pope Francis spoke about sort of condemning the very possession of nuclear weapons, and this was a step further for the Vatican as well, because they had already condemned the use or threat of use, but now I think it provides a lever for actors such as Pope Francis and others to say even possession is problematic, and I think that changes the debate a little bit.
Yeah. Matthew?
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for your presentation. I'm going to speak to like the one I chose because, so I chose national legislation including prohibiting investment in nuclear weapon producers. I guess because I'm worried about the tenuousness of international treaties as we've seen in the past, as opposed to like laws that states make, and knowing that when it comes to a national legislation that it becomes more in the collective consciousness of citizens. I just was wondering your thoughts on how do you believe that like politicians could be like dissuaded from sort of backing out of this? Like if a new government comes into power in a state that has signed on to this treaty, are there ways in which they are sort of prevented from just stepping away from it?
Yeah, there are some provisions in the treaty in the Articles 9 through 20 technical stuff that I breezed over because most of them are dull. Like, do you really care how the treaty is financed? Does that matter to your daily life? But yeah, there are some provisions. They try not to make it easy. But really the big one is the stigma against pulling out of treaties. I mean, we're obviously all a little jaded right now after the last few years. But one thing that we have to remember is the actions of the Trump administration in the US with regards to international agreements was a severe outlier.
Okay. Yeah.
Not common practice. I mean, we don't really see that many times that states change on a whim like that. I do have a vague understanding of the DPRK or North Korea pulling out of the NPT so they could develop their own nuclear weapons, but that was, a failure on a lot of levels, not necessarily a failure on the idea of treaties. So what's really important here is the stigma of pulling out. I mean, on the TPNW in general, like, do you want to be, especially in a democratically elected country, do you want to be the leader that's like, yeah, actually, we think it's okay for us to get some nuclear weapons. We don't mind the idea of mass murdering civilians. Like, then you have international condemnation, you have national level condemnation. Like it's the stigma against those sorts of decisions is pretty brutal.
Sure.
And then it brings into question your reliability for other things like trade agreements or other stuff, which is something that the US is now seeing as a result of their actions with the Iran deal, right? That people don't trust them as much. So yeah, stigma and like knock-on consequences are really helpful with this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions or Jessica?
Well, not a question, but so I voted for prohibitions as the number one value to me. And what I find so interesting about the process and the civil society leadership was this effort to create a new norm, because it was seen as normal, at least for some states, to have nuclear weapons and not as bad in some ways. And just that effort to try to change global public opinion and the opinion of states. Anyway, it's just so commendable. And it's fascinating how, I mean, it's not 100% successful yet, but without that initiative, the norm wouldn't be changing. So I've taken a lot of inspiration from this process and other work.
Yeah. Yes, and like the strength of the norm is really important. I see in the chat there, Paul reminded me that I had intended to mention that within Canada, the city councils are speaking up on this, which would make it much harder if Canada joined the TPNW and you have all these city governments that have endorsed the treaty. Ottawa voted yesterday to endorse the TPNW and the city's appeal. But yeah, I learned a lot about norms in university and different political theories and a lot of the importance of norms for constructing the international sphere. And so it's actually really fun now to be involved in creating those norms. Kelsey?
Yeah, and I mean, just to respond to what you just said, whoever's calling in from Ottawa, congratulations. I mean, it's great to see this, right? We have another municipality, obviously Canada's capital, that has endorsed the TPNW. And that kind of leads to my question, which is a broader question. Jess, you brought up public opinion. I know that over the years, there's been consistently public opinion polls on, the general person walking down Main Street, how they feel about things like the TPNW and whether or not their country should endorse such treaties. Can you maybe speak to how the public feels about these binding treaties, and are they hot to it? Are they cold to it? Any thoughts on that? And in particular, of course, within Canada, if possible, but more broadly as well.
Sure. I'm worried I'm going to spoil Caesar's parade here, but so I'll be really, really vague. And then if Caesar has it in his presentation, we can, if he doesn't have it, I'll throw stuff in the chat.
Some repetition is good on these things, I think.
Yeah. Generally, people like the idea of banning nuclear weapons. They are not super keen with this constant threat of annihilation. Call me surprised. Within Canada, the most recent polling is done now. COVID has blended all of the years together, so I'm going to go with 2021, but I'm concerned I'm wrong. But Caesar's giving me a thumbs up. I am right. Most recent polls from Canada show pretty overwhelming support for the TPNW. Or you see support. I can't think on the top of my head any treaty or any polling that I've seen recently that has a majority population against the TPNW. Yeah, people don't like the idea of dying in a nuclear war, and they see that maybe we should ban things, then like the idea of banning things that could cause our extinction. I'm sure Matt has thoughts on that. He's got his hand up. Okay, a question then?
I do. I have a question. Yeah, like I feel like what a lot of the opposition to the TPNW that I typically hear from folks in DC is a lot of them will say the same thing, which is this is a treaty that puts undue pressure on very specific countries that typically tend to be like more like quote unquote democratic, like countries that have more open civil societies because there are more tools of advocacy in places like the United States and the UK and in Europe than there are in China, Russia, North Korea. And I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts about that particular statement, but I would love to hear, like, from your perspective, like, how do you react to that statement? Like, does it resonate? Does it make any sense? And I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I mean, to be honest, when I hear that, sometimes I'm like, are you really complaining about democracy? Like, and you would like the ability to mass murder civilians, but democracy is getting in the way. It's essentially what comes to my mind. And I mean, anything that comes up in DC, I always take it with a grain of salt, because I mean, the Americans haven't signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child because they dislike anything that restricts them in any way internationally. So I mean, do I really want to listen to you? But anyways, I mean, part of the reason that we have international agreements is, even though people who potentially support the TPNW in countries like Russia and China face huge obstacles to speaking out and prison time and a lot of very negative things. I can go talk to the Russians at the UN. Caesar can go talk to China. Keeping things at the international level gives global civil society the ability to pressure those states. And yeah, they should stop whining about democracy. And yeah, we look at, I mean, everyone's always like, well, we can't, we have security concerns and we can't do it without the other countries. And I'm like, how do you think, Mozambique doesn't have security concerns? Like, does Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, not have security concerns from China, they can all do it without nuclear weapons. So I think a lot of the time that argument of, you know, the democracies are getting undue pressure, we need it for security. I mean, everybody has security concerns. I mean, look at Nepal. Like, Nepal's got some security concerns if anyone gets pissy in their neighborhood, surrounded by nuclear armed states. They don't need nuclear weapons. So, I mean, just do what your population wants. And your population does not want nuclear weapons.
So I see here that Matthew has his hand up. We're just coming up on the end of this. No, Matthew, no, you're good, buddy. We're just coming up on the end of this module. I was just going to check in and see, Erin, if we're almost close to wrapping, and then we'll move on to Caesar. If not, we do have some extra time, but.
Oh, no, I'm done whenever you guys stop asking me questions. I'm fine with that. I'll talk forever if people keep asking me questions, but Caesar could have taken over 5 minutes ago.
No, you're right on time. So we're going to have a question from Matthew, and then if anyone else has questions, ask them now, and then we can move on to the next module. Thanks so much.
Thanks. I actually am wondering, has there been any articulated punishment to, like, let's say Canada does sign on and becomes party to this treaty? Would there be any punishment or blowback from our allies for doing that, like, or like either perceived or like actual otherwise, or just?
I think it would really depend on what happens in the US in the next little while. I don't think any of us can assume that they're stable. But I mean, for allies more generally, I think if Canada was to shift to be more welcoming to the treaty, that would create space for other NATO allies. We see a lot of support through NATO parliaments for the treaty. And then we have like, Iceland is quite open to the treaty, Norway, Germany, the Netherlands Parliament, Belgium. In the past, Canada has been known as the nuclear nag in NATO. And I mean, your foreign minister, your defense minister might get a little scolded, but I mean, we're Canada, we're allowed to set our own foreign policy. And I mean, a sensible American administration realizes that they need us. I mean, look what's happened to baby formula in the US when they removed that from the new NAFTA situation, when something bad happens. So, I mean, they might be a little annoyed. They might demarche our government a little bit. There may be some yelling, but I mean, they probably have to revamp a little bit of plans for NORAD and NATO and stuff, but it's not things that couldn't be handled.
Okay. That's a relief to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it needs some political courage. And usually when I talk about the TPNW, I spend a lot of time talking about courage, because that's all you really need to make these changes. But I will maybe wrap it up on there and let Caesar get deep into Canada. Thanks, guys.